think about that smartphone in your pocket. How long should it last? 5 years. 10, maybe?
Yeah.
Now, how long will you actually keep it before you feel that itch to upgrade?
Good question.
And what about, say, that sturdy-looking kitchen blender? Looks like it should last forever, right?
You'd think so.
But maybe not. It's kind of a jolt, actually, when you realize the gap between how long things are supposed to last and how long we really keep them.
Yes.
And that gap, well, it has some pretty significant ripple effects for the environment.
Absolutely. And that's exactly what we're diving into today, this whole idea of product lifetime extension, or PLE as it's often called.
PLE, right.
We've basically sifted through a huge pile of research. I mean, one key source was a review looking at over 100 academic papers.
Wow, okay.
To really get to the heart of whether making things last longer truly gives us the environmental benefits we tend to assume it does.
Okay, let's unpack this a bit because, I mean, it feels like common sense, doesn't it?
It does on the surface.
Make stuff better, more durable, use it longer. That means less waste, fewer resources used, making new things. Simple. But our mission today, using all this research you've looked at, is to really put that simple idea under the microscope.
Exactly.
We want to know, does making products last longer actually help the environment as much as, our gut tells us it should?
Precisely. We're trying to cut through what can feel like, well, just a massive amount of information sometimes.
Yeah.
To get to the crucial arguments, maybe some surprises, and even some of the less obvious complexities around product lifetime extension.
The big question is, does making products last longer genuinely benefit the environment as much as we believe? We'll explore what the research actually says, uncover some key assumptions that, frankly, might be a bit shakier than we think, and maybe identify some potential pitfalls, too.
Okay. So where does this whole push for making things last longer actually fit, in the grand scheme of environmental efforts? Well, what's really interesting is how much more focus there is now on product durability, on longevity in environmental policy.
It feels like a newer thing. Or more prominent, maybe.
More prominent, definitely. If you look back, you can see a real evolution, especially with this whole circular economy idea.
Right.
Initially, a lot of the focus was on, say, cleaner production, making factories pollute less, and then on dealing with waste better, like improving recycling.
Okay, so tackling the start and the end of the product life.
Exactly. But maybe around 2015 or so, you see this noticeable policy shift towards keeping products in use for longer.
Oh, okay.
This idea of value retention, keeping things useful over time, it's become really central. It's about moving, up the waste hierarchy towards preventing waste in the first place.
And making things more durable is key to that prevention.
That's the idea, making them more durable so they last longer. And we're mainly talking about what the research calls durable consumer goods.
Okay.
Things like vehicles, furniture, appliances, electronics, clothes, that sort of stuff. The research specifically leaves out things like building materials, food, medicine, or, single-use plastic forks.
Got it. So the focus is on these durable goods. And policymakers often talk about durability as the main lever.
They do. Durability is often presented as the path to achieving that longer lifespan.
Okay, so durability, how well something's built, seems crucial. Right. But is that the only thing that matters for how long something actually sticks around?
That's a really important distinction to make. There's a difference between how durable a product is, like its technical potential,
right,
and how long it's actually used in the real world. We often call that actual usage time its longevity, or its lifetime extension.
So durability enables longevity, but doesn't guarantee it.
Precisely. Durability, how well it's engineered, can it withstand wear and tear? It certainly allows for a longer life. It creates the potential, but it doesn't guarantee it. Think about a really well-made pair of hiking boots, super durable.
Yeah.
They could last for years, handle tough trails. But if you decide next season you just prefer a different style or new color comes out,
right,
then their built-in durability didn't fully translate into extended longevity in your case.
That makes perfect sense. Okay. So what's the core environmental argument then for making things more durable, last longer?
Yeah.
What's the basic logic?
Well, the main benefit everyone expects from PLE is pretty straightforward.
Right.
A decrease in the total number of products we need to manufacture.
Okay.
The thinking goes like this. If the things we already own last longer, we won't need to replace them as often.
Right. Delayed replacement.
Exactly. And that reduced demand for new stuff will then naturally lead to less manufacturing overall, less making of things.
Okay, so it's that chain reaction. Longer life, less need for new,
Yeah.
less impact from making new.
That's the central idea, yes. However,
Okay.
and this is a big however flagged in the research.
Cool.
This logic really rests on two key assumptions. And these assumptions, well, they haven't been investigated nearly as much as you might think.
Okay, what are they?
The first assumption is that when we, as consumers, buy new products, it's primarily because our old ones have broken or worn out. Replacement-driven demand.
Okay. And the second?
The second is that industries, the manufacturers, decide how much stuff to produce based directly on that consumer demand signal. If demand drops, production drops.
Those sound like assumptions that might not always hold water in the real world, do they?
They might not.
So the foundation of this whole thing, which seems so obvious, might be resting on some surprisingly shaky ground.
That's a good way to put it. Shaky ground. And research often visualizes this logic quite simply,
How so?
They'll show a diagram, extend the life of product A, and boom, you avoid the whole environmental burden production, disposal of making product B, its replacement.
A neat one-for-one swap, environmentally speaking.
In theory, yes. Even if it's only partial avoidance depending on how much longer product A lasts.
But you mentioned exceptions earlier. This straightforward idea doesn't always apply.
No, it doesn't. While that general logic holds for many things, there's a really important exception, especially for products that use a lot of energy during their use phase.
Like appliances, fridges, washing machines.
Exactly. Things that are plugged in and running a lot. This is where the concept of environmentally optimal product lifetimes comes in.
Optimal lifetimes.
Meaning, the argument is that sometimes replacing an older, less energy-efficient product with a newer, much more efficient one sooner might actually be better for the environment overall, even if the old one isn't broken.
Right, so it's a trade-off.
Yeah.
The impact of making the new efficient thing versus the ongoing impact of running the old inefficient one.
Precisely that trade-off. Think of a really old fridge just guzzling electricity compared to a modern one.
Yeah.
Even though the old one still keeps things cold, the energy saved by the new one over, say, 10 years might outweigh the environmental cost of manufacturing it.
Okay, that makes sense.
But it's also important that even for these energy-hungry products, some research suggests these optimal lifetimes, they're still often longer than how long we actually use these products on average right now.
Okay. So even with the efficiency argument, we might still be replacing things too soon.
Potentially, yes.
Okay, so the simple model of longer is always better has limits. What other nuances does the research bring up? Things that complicate the picture?
Well, some researchers are really starting to question that direct, simple link between extending product life and actually reducing the flow of materials through society.
How so?
One interesting point is the idea that the total stock of products and materials we have in society is actually growing. We just have more stuff overall.
Right.
And maintaining all that stuff, even if individual items last longer, still has environmental costs. Think about storage space, repair infrastructure, the energy needed for maintenance.
So my car might last 20 years instead of 10. But if everyone just keeps their old 10-year-old car as a spare instead of getting rid of it when they buy the new, longer-lasting one,
It's exactly.
we haven't actually reduced the number of cars or the resources tied up in them. We've just accumulated more.
That hits the nail on the head. And this brings us to what might be the biggest wild card of all. Consumer behavior.
Us. What we actually do.
Yes, our actions, our choices play a massive role in determining whether PLE actually leads to less material flowing through the economy.
Right, because we're not just passive, are we? We decide whether to buy, when to buy, what to do with the old thing.
Hold up.
So it really boils down to this, doesn't it? Does making things last longer lead to us substituting, replacing an old purchase with a longer-lasting one? Or does it just lead to accumulation? We just end up owning more stuff.
That is the absolute crux of it. Substitution versus accumulation. And it's not a new question. Way back in 1977, a researcher named Kahn outlined two kind of extreme ways consumers might react.
What were they?
On one hand, we might just keep buying stuff at the same rate, but because things last longer, we just end up with more possessions, our total stock of goods increases.
Okay, accumulation.
On the other hand, the hope is we genuinely reduce how much we buy and throw away because our existing things are meeting our needs for longer.
Substitution.
Right. And the crucial point Kahn made, which still holds true according to this newer research, is that without really understanding these behaviors, which path we tend to take, it's basically impossible to predict accurately how much PLE will actually cut down production and disposal.
And it's not just us consumers, is it? What about the companies making this stuff? Their behavior matters too.
You're absolutely right. That's the other side of the coin. This behavioral complexity, this unpredictability, it extends to manufacturers as well.
How so?
Well, think about it. If consumer demand actually does decrease because products are lasting longer, how do companies react?
Good question.
Do they just keep producing the same amount and end up with warehouses full of unsold stock?
Maybe.
Or do they try to stimulate demand? Heavy marketing, maybe minor cosmetic changes touted as major innovations?
The must-have new feature trick.
Exactly. Or, the third option, do they actually reduce their production rates in line with lower demand?
Which is what the simple environmental logic assumes they'll do.
Right. But again, without detailed knowledge of their internal strategies, their market pressures, their business models, it's a huge unknown. We can't just assume they'll cut production.
And you mentioned earlier, this is a gap in the research. We don't actually have much data on how industries respond.
That's perhaps one of the most surprising findings from the review. There's a real lack of concrete empirical data tracking how industries actually adjust production volumes in response to changes in product lifespan or consumer demand patterns related to lifespan.
Wow. So that whole demand drives production link is, well, it's largely assumed, not proven in this context.
In this specific context of PLE impacts, yes. It makes predicting the overall environmental outcome incredibly difficult.
This is definitely way more complex than just make stuff last longer. Good for planet.
It really is.
So after digging through all this research, looking at over 100 papers, what does the academic literature actually say about the environmental effects of PLE? What are the main findings?
Okay, so this is where the literature review itself gets really interesting. A significant chunk of the publications they looked at, about a third actually, they basically state that PLE is environmentally beneficial, but without really explaining how or why.
Wait, really? A third? They just assert it.
Pretty much, just taken as a given. It's quite astonishing, really. You'd expect more detailed justification for such a core idea in sustainability.
Just a general vibe of, this must be good.
Sort of, yeah. Now, the majority of studies that do give reasons, they typically mention the things we've discussed. Delaying replacement, reducing overall demand for new products, which then leads to less production, and ultimately less waste. That's the common logic presented.
Okay.
But then there's a small group, maybe around 4%, that actually questions whether PLE is always beneficial.
The contrarians?
Well, or perhaps the realists. They often point out those trade-offs we talked about, like the energy efficiency issue with appliances.
Right, the optimal lifetime idea.
Or they raise doubts about consumer behavior. Will people really buy less? And another interesting point, many publications don't specify which products they're talking about. They just assume the benefits apply across the board.
Bit of a broad brush approach.
It can be, yes.
And how is this whole topic, this durability discourse, as the research calls it, how is it typically framed or discussed in academic writing? Are there common patterns?
Yes. The review highlighted a few key characteristics. First, there's a strong tendency to frame longevity, making things last almost as an end in itself, an inherent good.
With the environmental benefits just assumed to follow.
Exactly. Assumed, but often not explicitly explained or detailed. Even though the review specifically looked for papers connecting lifetimes and environmental impacts, a lot of them didn't really dig into the mechanisms of that link.
So the connection is often implied rather than rigorously demonstrated in some studies.
That seems fair to say, yes. Secondly, related to that, the research flagged a lack of explicit discussion about those crucial underlying links we keep coming back to.
The assumptions.
Right. How exactly does PLE lead to less demand, and how does less demand lead to less production? Those steps are often glossed over.
Okay.
And finally, the discussion often focuses heavily on delaying replacement and postponing demand without always drilling down into the concrete environmental metrics like actual energy saved or materials not used.
More about the delay than the outcome.
In some cases, yes. It was quite striking that only about a quarter of the studies mentioning benefits actually talked specifically about reduced production.
It sounds like the conversation sometimes stops a bit short of really nailing down the tangible environmental impact.
That's a good summary of one of the key findings. Okay, so that's the general discourse. Now, what about hard evidence? Empirical studies trying to measure these effects.
Right. Because theory is one thing, data is another. How much of this belief in PLE's benefits is backed up by actual concrete research findings?
Yeah, the million-dollar question. And the answer, according to this review, is, well, it's somewhat limited.
Oh.
A really large portion of the statements claiming environmental benefits from PLE either don't cite any source directly,
Seriously.
or they rely on sources that aren't actually based on empirical research themselves.
Yeah.
Policy documents, opinion pieces, that kind of thing.
So we're often operating more on accepted wisdom or theory than on rigorously proven results.
In many instances, yes. Only a minority of the publications analyzed actually based their claims about benefits on the results of their own empirical studies or cited other empirical work.
Okay. So a lot of the argument floats around without strong empirical anchors.
That's a fair way to put it. And then when you look at the empirical research that does exist,
What does it look like?
it's predominantly quantitative, lots of life cycle assessments, LCAs, and mathematical modeling.
Okay, standard methods.
But here's the crucial part. These methods, particularly the modeling, often assume the very behaviors we've been questioning.
They build the assumptions into the model.
Often, yes. They assume people will replace less often, and they assume industries will cut production accordingly. They model the expected outcome, rather than studying whether those behaviors actually happen in the messy real world.
That feels a bit circular. Modeling the result you expect based on assumptions that need testing.
It can be. And it's also worth noting that a significant chunk of these empirical studies come from what's called gray literature.
Meaning?
Reports from NGOs, consulting firms, government bodies, not necessarily peer-reviewed academic journals, which isn't inherently bad, but it's part of the overall picture of the evidence base.
Okay, so the quantitative stuff often assumes the behaviors, which makes the studies that do look at actual behavior even more important, right?
Absolutely critical. That small number of empirical studies that actually try to investigate consumer behavior, what do people do with longer-lasting products? How does it affect their next purchase? These are vital.
And what do those behavioral studies tell us? Do they back up the simple assumption? Longer lasting means less buying?
Generally, no, not really. It's more complicated.
Okay.
For instance, way back in 1982, an OECD report flagged how difficult it is to predict what happens when you implement PLE policies, precisely because consumer behavior is so varied and we lacked good data.
So this isn't a new problem.
Not at all. And more recent field studies seem to confirm this complexity. There was one in Norway looking at appliances, another in the Netherlands looking at clothing.
Yeah, what did they find?
Both found that when people get new things, even potentially longer-lasting things, it often leads to accumulation rather than simple replacement.
So they keep the old fridge running in the garage, or the new clothes just add to the pile?
Exactly. The old appliances were often kept, maybe moved elsewhere but still in use, and new clothes tended to supplement the wardrobe, not replace items one for one.
Interesting.
And there was work by WRAP, that's a UK organization focused on waste reduction.
Yeah.
They found that even with efforts to get people to extend the life of their clothes, the overall demand for new clothing actually went up.
Up, despite trying to make clothes last longer?
Yeah. Counterintuitive, isn't it?
Definitely. What about things like secondhand markets? Does buying used stuff displace the need for new stuff?
That's been looked at too, particularly for clothing. The studies suggest there is some displacement, yes. Buying secondhand can reduce demand for new, but it's often limited. People who buy secondhand might also be buying new items. Plus, there's a question mark over whether a secondhand item gets used for the same amount of time as a brand new one would have been. The data's still a bit fuzzy there.
Okay, so the consumer behavior side doesn't neatly support the less buying assumption. What are the other big assumption that industry production just follows consumer demand downwards? Any research on that?
This is a really key point. And honestly, the answer from the literature review is pretty stark. There's a major lack of empirical research specifically looking at this link in the context of PLE.
Really? We just don't have much data on how companies react.
Astonishingly little, it seems, based on what the review found. We don't have a solid, evidence-based understanding of how industries actually adjust their production levels when faced with potentially lower demand due to longer product lifespans.
Wow. So we're missing a really crucial piece of the puzzle, then a huge blind spot.
Absolutely. That fundamental gap in knowledge, understanding the real relationship between how long products last and the actual flow of materials through society. Something Kahn pointed out back in the 70s.
Still exists.
It still largely exists, especially around these crucial behavioral aspects for both consumers and producers.
Which raises the worrying specter of unintended consequences, doesn't it?
Yeah.
If we're pushing for PLE based on these potentially flawed assumptions.
It really does. If those core assumptions that demand is mainly replacement driven and that production automatically follows demand down if those are wrong,
Yeah.
then all our efforts to make products last longer could paradoxically just lead to accumulation. More products, growing stocks of stuff in homes and warehouses, instead of the intended outcome of reduced production.
And that accumulation could have its own negative environmental impacts, right? It's not automatically benign just because the individual items last longer.
Precisely. Think about it. If we make super durable, reusable shopping bags, but people just collect dozens of them and maybe still use single-use ones sometimes.
We've increased the impact of making the durable bags without getting the full benefit.
Right. Or think about furniture that's built to last 50 years, but people redecorate every 10 and just store the old durable stuff. That takes up space, maybe requires climate-controlled storage. There are impacts there.
Or even the materials themselves.
Yeah, good point. More durable materials, like some synthetic textiles, might last longer in use, but they can also cause problems at the end of their life. Think microplastic shedding from synthetics, for example. It's complex.
So it always comes back to that core question. Are we achieving substitution? One long-lasting item replacing several short-lived ones, or just accumulation? More stuff overall?
That's the critical balance, and the research makes it crystal clear. We urgently need more investigation into this balance, what drives it in different product categories, for different types of consumers, and crucially, how industry reacts.
Okay, so after this really fascinating deep dive into the research,
Yeah.
what's the main takeaway for us? The headline.
I think the central insight really is that the environmental benefits of making products last longer, well, they're just not as automatic or straightforward as they might seem at first glance.
Okay.
They depend heavily on how both consumers, like you and me, and industries actually behave in response. And those behaviors, they don't always line up neatly with the simple assumptions underlying the whole push for durability.
That's definitely a thought-provoking takeaway.
Right.
It really makes you wonder if the current policies, which often seem to focus heavily on just making things more durable, are actually, hitting the mark on their own.
And that's a really important question for you, the listener, to mull over, isn't it? Are policies just focused on product durability enough? Or do we need something more comprehensive? An approach that also tackles our consumption patterns head-on and gets real about what truly drives production decisions in the first place.
It encourages you to maybe look at your own habits, doesn't it? How long do you actually keep things? Why do you replace them?
Yeah.
It sounds like if we truly want to understand and manage our environmental impact, we have to look beyond just the lifespan of one product in isolation.
Absolutely.
We need to consider the whole system, how things are made, how we use them, why we stop using them, and what happens next, the bigger picture.
Couldn't agree more. And perhaps that's fertile ground for future deep dives looking into different models for more sustainable consumption, or maybe exploring the role manufacturers could or should play in building a genuinely circular economy.